right, joining us now is Rajiv Biswas, the Asia Pacific Chief Economist at IHS Markit in Singapore. Good to have you, Rajiv.
Thank you.
All right, we're at a time in this planet where every international organization comes under fire. Their effectiveness assessed, whether it's the United Nations, WHO, the International Criminal Court, you name it. So what is your assessment of the effectiveness still of the WTO?
Well, the WTO has not been able to achieve any landmark trade agreements in the way that the GATT had done during its term of existence. So the WTO, in the sense of advancing trade liberalization, has not had those huge successes that the GATT had in the period since it was formed after the end of the Second World War. However, it has continued to provide a broad framework for international trade amongst 164 member countries. And that includes procedures for trade dispute resolution and arbitration. So the WTO does still play an important role in terms of governance of the existing global trading system, because if you didn't have the WTO, there would be no multilateral system for the world trade. There would be regional agreements that still work amongst regions like the EU, or in Asia, there's other agreements like RCEP. But at a global level, you wouldn't have that. So the WTO still is playing an important role. And there are still many issues that are brought before the WTO in terms of trade disputes.
Sure. I think that's a fair assessment. And, you know, it is, as you said, it's what we got. Just like people say with the United Nations, but better that we have it than we don't. But you look at the world's biggest economies and how they've responded to the World Trade Organization recently. I mean, under President Trump, the United States threatened to leave the WTO. It threatened to have China kicked out. It threatened to block judges, which it did do for a time. And China's record on complying with the WTO is quite poor. So is there less of an appetite of countries to even want to go along with what they agreed to?
Well, I think the WTO, reflects what's going on in the world system at the moment. The WTO is a consensus-based organization made up of its 164 members. So in order to achieve results, it needs support of the member countries. And if you do have these huge geopolitical rivalries between the great powers, that does affect the operation of the WTO and its agreements, because, as you've mentioned, issues such as the U.S. position on China start to affect the U.S. stance, and China equally is affected by that. And there's many other examples of geopolitical rivalries all over the world that are flowing into the operations of the WTO. So the WTO obviously exists within the global environment that we're in politically, and I think that is a very big factor that's affecting its ability to reach further progress in terms of trade liberalization. But I think there have been important achievements, particularly the recent agreement back in June this year on fisheries subsidies was actually quite an important landmark achievement.
Yeah, and you also have vastly differing opinions among these large economies on what consensus is, what the international order is, what compliance even is, making it so much more difficult. All right, Rajiv Biswas, great to have you.